another stroll in the shadows, one more familiar street. It seems that history is bound to repeat. That's how my destiny's drawn. Just when the story is shifting, turns out it's too good to last. Maybe I just can't escape from the past as I go chasing the dawn. Why don't you just release me and go your separate way? My heart has nothing left to give away. Another drink for my troubles, another cold cigarette. I'm not the type, but I'll take a bet that flame will keep burning on as I go chasing the dawn, as I go chasing the dawn, as I go chasing the dawn.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Radio Free America. We have an extremely special guest, the scourge of the academic world, the one, the only, Jared Taylor. How are you, Mr. Taylor?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me to be on your program.
I am honored for you to be here. For 2 years, I've been emailing people trying to get in touch with you, but I haven't been able to. And that's why I sent the super chat the other day. I was like, oh, maybe he'll notice now, you know. But I also got Brian Hendricks. He is the author of Culture and Genetics, and he's going to have a couple questions as well. But first, I just got to ask you, what do you think about what's going on right now?
That's a big question. What I'll tell you is this. The really important message that all of us should be getting is that rioting works. Rioting is effective. Let's imagine that George Floyd had died precisely as he did, and that video got all around. And let's also imagine that black people did the civilized thing and waited for an investigation, waited for an indictment, waited for trial, and accepted the verdict. Mm-hmm. None of all of this outpouring of humiliation, all of this money that's being promised, all of these people crawling on their knees and their bellies, all of these people howling and yelling about unconscious systemic racism, none of that would have happened. Rioting and violence gets attention. And did you know, at last count, if you count up all the millions that have been promised and pledged for Black Lives Matter movements and all of these Black uplift movements, it comes to about $500 million. It's going to be beefsteaks for the boys in all of these organizations. Yes, all of that. And besides that, Confederate statues coming down, the statue of Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia coming down, the statue of the Texas Ranger at Dallas Airport coming down. All of this is the result of all of this rioting, looting, arson, and violence. Violence works. Violence works so long as it's in the name of Black Lives Matter.
If I can ask a follow-up, Halsey,
please.
To that, how much would you say, if any, this is directly related to a larger Marxist push for perhaps their fabled revolution, or do you draw a distinction between that and a minority cause?
I really don't think that there is much in the way of a Marxist revolution in the works. I think very few people really still believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat and the public ownership of the means of production, the withering away of the state, labor theory of value, all of that classic Marxism. I think nobody practically believes in that anymore. You do have a small group of what are called Antifa. These people are more anarchists than Marxists. How exactly they think the state is going to operate, that society is going to operate without any kind of government at all, I don't know. But they're a small band of ultra-violent people, and they have been active in this, no question about it. But to me, what we are seeing now is the inevitable culmination of telling black people for the last 50, 60, even 70 years that everything that has ever gone wrong for them is our fault. And it is these ideas such as white privilege and systemic racism colorblind racism, unconscious racism, and the idea that white silence is violence. I mean, while you're sleeping, that's violence. Is the silence of the tomb violence? If you see the way all of these Confederate monuments and all of these monuments to dead people are being pulled down, I guess even in the silence of the tomb, white silence is violence, so they've got to be snuffed out. All of these extreme and absolutely cuckoo ideas are coming out of the nut houses that we call universities, to the point where practically every open-eyed, empty-headed white person believes this nonsense. That is the extraordinary thing that we're seeing today. Not any kind of, I think, Marxist revolution. No, it is this pent-up hatred that we have taught blacks to feel for us. After all, if you're told every waking hour of every waking day, practically, you see those white people over there, they are grinding you down. White people, past, present, and future. They wake up every morning, they spit on their hands, they get to work and say, how am I going to make life miserable for you, black people? And when you're told that over and over again, how can you help but hate white people? And we're seeing the consequences now.
I mean, especially when you have something like disparate impact, right? Is that they claim that it doesn't matter whether the intent was racist, only the result is a disparate impact. And then they say, oh, that's true. If it's that more black people get arrested, it's just disparate impact. It has nothing to do with that we commit more crime. And then they hang us with it.
You know, the New York Times had an absolutely remarkable piece on June 6th. It had a headline about the Minneapolis police. And the headline said, Minneapolis police use violence on black people 7 times more likely than on white people. Well, it completely left out anything about arrest rates. If black people are arrested at 10 or 12 times the white rate, then you would expect that the police are obligated to use force of some kind. This is not necessarily lethal force, but giving them a taser, putting hands on them. You would of course expect them to be subject to police force at a rate higher than that of whites. To completely leave out arrest rates, leave out the disproportionate amount of police contact, potentially unpleasant and violent police contact in a comparison of that kind, is not just irresponsible. I think it is outright lying. It's outright deception. It would be like saying, if you're a man living in Minneapolis, the police are 7 times more likely to lay hands on you than a woman. Isn't that absurd, horrible, awful, anti-male prejudice and sexism? Well, no. If it is men who are committing the crimes, fighting with the police, getting arrested, then of course they're more likely to have hands laid on them by the police. This kind of utterly deceptive and, I think, profoundly dishonest reporting is part of what's behind this belief that so many people seem to have, that white cops out there, all they think about doing is somehow being mean to innocent black people. This is a myth. This is nonsense, but it's a very, very destructive one.
I mean, even Fox News, which supposedly is right-wing, I haven't thought they were right-wing for a very long time. They report that there's a new show called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. And today, Matthew McConaughey went on it. And he asked for help in getting rid of his white allergy, which is that when he walks down the street, bad things happen to black people just because of his presence. And that's what he said. White allergy.
Well, you mean because a white man walks down the street, bad things happen to black people?
Yep. That's what he told him. He said because people look at the black person as a criminal and him as a rich celebrity. So just because of that, it's a harming of society that he's come out in the street. This is what he said. I mean, the guy's kind of cuckoo anyway, but I mean, what comes out of Hollywood is next level crazy. The universities are bad, but this is next level crazy.
Well, it essentially is taken for granted among lefties that somehow, with every breath we exhale, we white people poison the air for black people. That we don't have to be consciously racially involved at all. In fact, there are these anti-racism instructors who will say, it's not good enough to be a good person. That's not good enough. You have to be devoting yourself every day to fighting white privilege, fighting white supremacy. Just being a good person isn't good enough if you're white. This is an astonishing double standard. And the theory, of course, is that nothing that goes wrong for black people is their fault at all. There has never been a lazy or a stupid or a criminal black person. Anything that goes wrong is somehow our fault. And when you think about it, it's a way of treating black people as if they were utterly mindless marionettes. Simply by not, you and me, simply by not constantly combating white supremacy, whatever that is, we are making them shoot each other, get each other pregnant before they get married, drop out of school, take drugs. It's all somehow our fault because we don't think the right things. What we do or don't do, what we say or don't say, it's got nothing to do with it. It's all up in our minds. And somehow we are able to trick and fool and manipulate these black people into all this destructive behavior just because we are not perpetually fighting systemic racism. It's ultimately, it's the most condescending, insulting thing you can imagine towards blacks, but they eat it up because it exempts them of any kind of responsibility.
A follow-up to what you're speaking about right there directly, you know, because you said earlier that if you were told that all your life, yes, you'd believe it. But we know that from Joseph Sheldon Hutcherson and Tony Tempa to double the amount of white people killed by police every year in ways just like George Floyd that never get reported, someone is hiding the truth and pushing this propaganda to the black people. And I would assume that it's not the black people themselves doing it. I wonder what is this nefarious force, maybe, if you would want to just frame it like that, and you know who exactly is doing that and for what purpose.
You know, I'm not one who thinks that liberals are evil. I think they genuinely believe that what they're doing is good. They have convinced themselves that everything that does go wrong for non-whites is the fault of whites. They believe that. And of course, they don't believe it's really their fault. It's the fault of other white people. And white people, there is no way for a white person to feel more virtuous than to condemn other white people, particularly blue-collar white people. I think there's a school district in Wisconsin in which everybody gets seminars in white privilege, including bus drivers and janitors.
There's two of them here in Jersey that do too.
Is that right?
Yep.
The idea of bus drivers and janitors being lectured on their white privilege and how they are implicitly propping up white supremacy. What the hell nonsense is this? Here you are probably working two jobs. You are working your fingers to the bone, trying to make enough money to get the kids' teeth straightened and maybe send a child to college. And some clown walks into your workplace and says, you know, you are propping up white supremacy. You are the unworthy beneficiary of white privilege. You know, it's surprising to me that some of these people don't go postal. You get fed a line of baloney like that. But no, it's these people really do think that if black people or Hispanic people have a problem, it's our fault. And the more we are constantly reminded of how bad we are and how much more we must try to be good, that will solve the problem. I think they genuinely believe this. I don't think that people are capable of lying through their teeth day after day, saying things that they know are not true. Human beings just don't work that way. So yeah, I think they sincerely believe this stuff. But they are deluded, and they are deluding the rest of the country at the same time.
I tell this story all the time. I have a relative that works at an inner city school, right? She teaches math in remedial classes, like resource room classes. And they have the best VOTEC school it's a train by my house, so I apologize. They have a resource, VOTEC programs. It's in the top 10 in the entire country every year. I mean, this is it's a more beautiful building than the high school itself, right? If a kid says, I want to be in the NBA when I graduate high school, kid's never played a day of basketball, doesn't know anything. If they suggest to the kid, if he's black or Hispanic, if they suggest to him he should go to VOTEC and learn to weld or learn how to, do plumbing or anything like that, they will get written up. And if they do it twice, they get fired for racism. They have to tell the kid he's ready to go to college unless they ask for it. They can say, I want to learn to weld, and then the teachers can tell them about it.
I'm not at all surprised. You know, something that has leaked out of lefty confines and universities and these various idiotic people that set the agenda for us is this idea of institutional racism. Well, institutional racism is somehow racism without racists. There is just some kind of foul miasma floating around the institutions of America that keeps black people and brown people, black and brown people. That's the new catchphrase. Keeps black and brown people down. Well, wait a minute. How can an institution be racist? Either there are people who are constantly harming and exploiting other people, or there aren't. You can't have the halls of Congress somehow all on their own keeping black people down. And I was listening to C-SPAN just 2 days ago, and a woman from the Brookings Institution, I wish I remembered her name, one of these experts on race relations, she was going on and on about institutional racism. And she said, and now let me give you an example. Well, my ears pricked right up. I want to know. She said, it costs too much money if you are in prison to make a phone call. And most prisoners are black and brown people. And so this racist system is part of the institutional racism they have to deal with. Well, frankly, I don't know how much it costs a jailbird to make a phone call, but I'm sure that the cost is the same, whether you're black or brown or purple or white or green. Again, this is, in effect, disparate impact. By that, in other words, because more black people or brown people are in prison per capita than white people, the fact that you got to pay anything, that you got to pay a dime to make a phone call is institutional racism. Well, by that standard, all the laws against murder or bribery or rape, they are institutional racism because black and brown people are more likely to be caught up in those laws and go to prison. But this is a Brookings Institution expert explaining why things are so tough and why we have to transform American society. I have seen this kind of idiocy growing over the last 30 years. I've been involved in this for 30 years. I started American Renaissance back in 1990. It's hard to believe I've been doing it for this long.
Yeah.
But I never expected it to reach this astonishing head of steam so quickly and so suddenly.
You describe it very well. Just a random foul odor miasma. One of the more popular videos I have seen recently that is supposed to prove, quote unquote, systemic racism. One, Ben Shapiro just did a video one the other day. Is a man who wrote this video and animated it. These little cute cartoons, and literally said at the end of it that the effect of systemic racism, it has no cause you can find, nothing at which you can point. So people who have an IQ over 70 or know the first thing about scientific methodology, like you are stating an effect that is so pervasive that it calls for the banishment of white people from their own nations, yet you can't point to one cause.
Now, boy, Ben Shapiro doesn't believe this baloney, does he?
Oh no, he was debunking it the best he could.
Yeah. Yes. Well, see, it's years ago I wrote an article about what the Maoris thought in New Zealand, the New Zealand native Maoris.
Mm-hmm.
They believed that there was nothing in the world that was bad, that was not caused by some sort of malevolent spirit put in motion by an enemy. So if you stubbed your toe one day and it got infected, somebody out there is messing with you. Or if it rains on your birthday, somebody is messing with you. And we have this kind of witchcraft view of racism. It doesn't matter if there's nobody out there that you can pinpoint. I ask people, okay, if America's a white supremacist society, where are the white supremacists? Who are they? What are they doing to hold black and brown people down? It's very difficult to point to race. They'll say, oh, Donald Trump. Wait a minute. What on earth has Donald Trump ever done to hurt black people. Name me
Give
one
them
specific thing.
jobs.
Yeah, yes, yes. He's delighted that the unemployment rate is going down.
Hmm.
So it's a kind of magical thinking, and yes, this institutional racism stuff is just such pathetic baloney. The other aspect of this that is just head swimmingly crazy is the notion of white privilege. Now, wouldn't it be the case if America were 100% white? There could be no white privilege, right? If it's all white people, how can there be white privilege? Somehow, though, the presence of blacks and Hispanics, now all of a sudden we got privilege. And so we are genuinely supposed to believe that by getting into this, by having in this country a high crime, high poverty, high welfare population that hates us, that gives us privilege? Well, I mean, where does this cuckoo-ness come from? And how does privilege work? I mean, the more and more come in, the more privileged we are. Is the last white man left in this country who will be a despised white man? Is he benefiting from more privilege than ever in the history of the world? I mean, if the people in Estonia, they don't have any black people. If you imported 20,000 Somalis into Estonia, would the Estonians would be suddenly better off because they had white privilege? The very concept is so preposterously stupid. And yet politician after politician, editorial writer after editorial, preacher, all of these academics, oh yeah, we all got white privilege. But, I just don't know how to begin to deal
Also,
with this mass insanity.
It's the
It's
same
also
level
a
of
very-
stupid as diversity is our strength. Because if you'll notice, there isn't a single country except for a white country where diversity is valued. You would
Yeah.
think that because Africa is a toilet and it's 98% black, you would think that they would say what they're suffering from is a lack of diversity, and it's obvious in how bad it is. What we need to do is send more white people to Africa to diversify it, because then their strength will be our strength. But no, you would never hear that. They would call colonialism.
Well, of course, if there were more white people in Africa, it would do them a lot of good. Diversity actually can be good for a country if it's starting off with a very, very low level, non productive population. If you were to add Asians to Africa, for example, you'd suddenly get a more law abiding, harder working group. And that would be good for the Africans to the extent that they want to raise their GNP. Now, if there were enough Asians, it would raise their GNP considerably, but the Asians would end up running the country. So they've got a choice. They can have lots of Asians, and have a higher GNP, better healthcare system, higher life expectancy, and give up control of the country. Or if they want to be the majority, they want to make the rules, then they're going to be stuck in exactly the situation that they're in. Now, what we are dealing with here is a fundamental unwillingness to recognize an obvious truth, and that is that the races are different. Blacks, on average, are less intelligent than whites. You find evidence for this everywhere you look, in every period of history, every part of the world. Now, if you reject this obvious truth, and if you say, well, no, black people are just as smart, just as hardworking as white people, and the fact that they have a household income, a household net worth, I was to say, of just 1/10 of white people, that their income is only 2/3, that the crime rates are 7 times as great. If we take as our point of departure the absolute and undebatable conviction that they're just as smart and hardworking, just as able to defer gratification, just as able to save up for their retirement as white people, then you're left with only one explanation: white wickedness. And so, for as long as the United States is going to be unwilling to look the truth of racial differences in the face, people are always going to be inventing one silly, implausible, preposterous excuse for blacks after another. And white privilege, that's a relatively recent one. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, people talked about white privilege? No. People didn't even talk about white supremacy then. These days, it's not enough. Back in those days, people talked about discrimination. White people discriminated against blacks. Well, then pretty soon, discrimination wasn't a nasty enough word. So we talked about racism. White people are racist. Now, racism isn't a nasty enough word. So if things are going bad for black people, it's because of white supremacy. I don't think there's a single white supremacist in the United States. A white supremacist is presumably somebody who wants to rule over people of other races. No, who wants to do that? The people who have really wide awake views about non-whites in this country, blacks or Hispanics, they just want to go our own way. We wish them well, but we don't want to have to carry them around on our backs. That's not white supremacy.
I think Peggy McIntosh is the mother of the white privilege movement. I could
Yes.
be wrong about that, but I think
Oh
she
yeah.
was the originator in the 80s.
Yes, that's right. And the examples she gives of of white privilege, she says, if you're white in America, you can buy bandages that are the color of your skin.
You can't not laugh at that.
And she says, if you are white in America, you can turn on the television and you can see people who look like you. Well, does that mean in Nigeria, the fact that you can turn on the television and see people who look like you, is that black privilege? I mean, that's just the fact is that's the fact of a majority population. And she would say, if you are a white person, you can walk into a store and the store detective or the store security won't keep a beady eye on you. That's white privilege. Well, if anything, that is earned privilege. It's because the people who are doing security in the store know very well who the shoplifters are. They know very well who's going to be running some kind of flash mob that comes in and tears everything off the shelves. Is that's some sort of white privilege? Well, if
It's
it's white
it
privilege, it's something we absolutely earned because of our good behavior.
and
All
it's
of this
and
is
it's
just baloney.
it's not even true in all cases. I grew up probably more indigent than any black person in America. I grew up in mountain hollers, and if anybody knows anything about them, 80% of them still have outhouses.
Mm.
I mean, that's how poor people are in the hollers of Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky. I go into Kmart wearing my duct tape shoes and my ripped up jean shorts, and there's always somebody on your back. It's like you say, it's like they know who's coming in there to steal. Where I grew up with poor white people, it was the poor white people stealing. I never stopped
Hmm.
and said, "Hey, I'm being stereotyped." I understood because my friends would be stealing.
Yeah,
So,
there you
I mean,
go.
I knew.
It's called pattern recognition. But don't forget, even in your duct taped shoes, even in your poor, hollow, poor white trash existence, you were benefiting from white privilege. You may
Mhm.
not have known it, but every breath you took, you were better off than the richest, most famous, most slobbered over, most petted and coddled black person in America because you were white. Don't forget that.
Oh, I know. I didn't taste steak until I was 16. Meanwhile, I see uh, women with their SNAP cards in Walmart with nothing but steak and lobster and shrimp and all the sugary sodas they can stand.
Well, there you go. Now that you know that you got white privilege, you got to work real hard,
I,
24 hours a day to dismantle that white privilege.
I need to take a class.
We all need to take a class.
Hmm.
Brian
Yes,
had a
sir.
question for you about culture and genetics that I want to make sure we get to before.
Yeah. I was going to make sure that let you cue it up because I know you got limited time here. Well, I wanted to say before that, Mr. Taylor was talking about IQ, and I don't know how much, if you had to weigh, how much weight that you give their behaviors to IQ. For me, I put the behaviors up more to a genetic evolution breeding strategy where you had nomadic hunter gatherers who had a breeding strategy polar opposite of European Caucasus region sedentary agrarians, where in sub-Saharan Africa it wasn't about who was the most competent, who could dig a well to save water. The person who stood out to be the best fit for breeding was the person who could go steal water and have immediate resources. And I see that reflected today in the way that black people act compared to white people, compared to Asian people, compared to Jewish people. That you see a lot of this in athletes. When they get money, they immediately go broke because they're buying all of these flashy things, the bling bling, and those breeding strategies have stuck with us, and that's what drives a whole lot of their bad decision making, in my opinion. Not just the IQ, not that that helps, of course.
Well, um, the really definitive book on this subject is one called Race, Evolution, and no Race, Genetics, and Race, Genes, and Evolution by Philippe Rushton. And he has gone into very considerable detail about the patterns that separate blacks from whites from Asians. And it has to do, as you say, with a kind of breeding strategy. And blacks are much more likely to start having children at a young age, don't do much parental investment. They live more for the present. They are less able to defer gratification and take a long-term view towards things. They mature more quickly. They have first age of intercourse is younger than whites. Now, at the same time, they have a higher dizygotic, that is to say, non-identical twinning rate. This is a kind of a cheap investment strategy, many young, and we'll just hope that some of them work out all right.
Yeah,
Whereas
more R
the
than
high,
K.
yes, RK strategy is how the scientists distinguish between the two.
Yeah.
Now, Asians actually are more K, that is to say, they are more long-term, more likely to invest in a smaller number of children than whites are. There's a very, very consistent pattern of blacks at one end, Asians at the other, and we're somewhere intermediate, although closer to the Asians. So, yes, I agree 100% with you, but as far as the day-to-day choices that so many blacks make, it has to do with, I believe, a lower IQ and also, and this is an important aspect as well, a less developed ability to defer gratification. In other words, instead of spending that buck now, saving it for a raining day. You can do a test of this that's very interesting. You give children the option of one marshmallow now or two marshmallows 15 minutes from now. If you can have that marshmallow, sit that on a plate in front of you and stare at it for 15 minutes without eating it, then we'll give you two marshmallows. White children are much better at not eating that marshmallow than black children, and Asian people are better at not eating that marshmallow than white people.
With the highest per capita rates of obesity and diabetes, I don't think they're giving up too many marshmallows. So they are definitely
Well,
taking the marshmallow. Halsey, did you want me to go ahead and ask my second one, or did you want to get back in here?
No, please ask your second one.
Okay.
Everyone's really interested.
Well, this one's going to take a little longer to set up because first we have to qualify that culture was first defined by physical anthropology in the late 1800s, if I recall correctly. Cultural anthropology isn't necessarily an anthropological branch more than it is a humanity that just took the name anthropology. They changed the definition of culture to food, your hair, and your music. Culture used to be defined as the foundational underpinnings of your society on top of which your society was built, your laws, your customs, your agrarian habits, the way you treated people, morality used to be culture. And now insofar as we want to use the older definition before they bastardize it, for lack of a better term, to denote culture, which is more about an overarching habitat, my belief is that it is and only is genetic, in that maybe 80-20, 85-15 nature has anything to do with shaping culture over genetics. I think culture is expressly genetic.
well, it's true that up until I don't remember when the change was made, people did reserve the term culture for real achievement, societal achievement,
Yeah,
something
advancement,
like
achievement. Yeah.
literature, symphonic music, opera, drama, architecture. These are genuine culture. But the whole word of culture became cheapened to refer to any pattern of folkways. So that if you have genital mutilation among Islamic tribeswomen, that's a form of culture.
Yeah, it
If
went
you
from.
have, yeah,
I was just going to say real quick. It went from foundational aspects to topical, mutable aspects.
anything at all. But,
Hmm.
and it is very common to say, well, why is it that Asians do so well in the United States or in Asia for that matter? And people will say, oh, it's because they've got this wonderful culture, a wonderful culture that emphasizes saving, emphasizes discipline, emphasizes studying and hard work. Well, where does culture come from? Culture is not something that drops out of the sky. And the Asians were lucky that where they happened to be, a nice culture dropped out of the sky. And Black people were very unlucky because the culture that dropped out of the sky in sub-Saharan Africa was a bad culture. No, it doesn't work that way. Culture, as you suggest, is deeply rooted in the genetics, the genetic substrate of the people who created that culture. So, no, the idea that, it's all culture. As long as we can change the culture, then lickety split, they'll all be just as hardworking and just as people able to do long range planning as Asians. No, the culture is very, very much rooted in biology. And that's why when people talk about people replacing white societies, we see this mass immigration going on that is changing our societies and is reducing whites to a minority, certainly in the United States and increasingly in European countries as well. The idea that the culture will not change is nonsense because Western civilization can be maintained and carried forward in a meaningful way only by the people who are biologically descended from the people who created that culture.
And
And if you can imagine the Japanese, say the Japanese are just sort of withering away. There aren't going to be any more Japanese. They're being replaced by Pakistanis and Filipinos or whatever it is. Would they be content knowing that there are a few honky round eyes who know how to do tea ceremony or who practice Japanese martial arts? Is that all that's required for Japanese society to survive, for Japanese culture to survive? Absolutely not.
no, of course
Japanese culture requires Japanese people.
not. And
European culture requires European people because culture and genes are very, very closely linked.
and
So let me ask a quick follow up to that then.
Mhm.
How do we maintain it then? Because, like you said, in America, we're at 62%, and I think that includes non full whites, like mulattoes and people like that. So if we're at 62% right now, and the immigration patterns, the fertility patterns are not in our favor, how
No.
do we preserve that culture? How do we maintain it over the next 100 years, let's say?
I believe that the only way that we can preserve some form of genuine Western civilization on the North American continent is if there is some portion of it that is exclusively and in perpetuity ours. There has to be some part of America that is going to be European and self consciously European. If that's not the case, we will be a dwindling, despised minority. And there will be bits and pieces of our culture left. But for the most part, it'll become this mishmash, this Afro Cuban, Hispanic, Caribbean, Asiatic, just this unrecognizable goo that has ingredients from all around, but no coherence, and certainly not something that the founding fathers would have recognized as a kind of nation in which they would have wanted their descendants to live. No, our civilization requires us. We have the right to be us, and only we can be us. But that is something that is absolutely heresy in today's parlance. And everyone understands. I mentioned the Japanese before, but it's the same for anybody else, the Turks or the Chinese or the Koreans or the Vietnamese. Uh, they have a natural and unquestioned right to remain the majority in their countries. It is only whites for whom, if a Frenchman wants France to remain French, or if an Italian wants Italy to remain Italian, they are Nazis. They are white supremacists. They're wicked, hateful, evil people. This is a double standard that's applied exclusively to white people. And it's a suicidal double standard. Until white people are prepared to say, no, sorry, our ancestors built this for us. You, where you come from, you could not have built this society. And we, sorry, but we cannot afford to share it with large numbers of your people because the society our ancestors built will cease to be the society that we want to live in.
But how do you
Now,
answer the people though that say Italy for Italians, France for French people? There is no whiteistan. So how do you say the culture that we built here, the European culture, is one culture? I know that I believe you, but how do you convince someone who isn't conscious of this that there
I
is a
got an
white
answer, but I'll
identity
let
but not a
Mr.
national
David.
identity?
most people, even if they're white, they despise the idea of a white racial identity. But there are American values. Now, these days, people would describe American values as being open to diversity or open to this, tolerance, diversity. Those are the American values. No, American values are very firmly rooted in Europe. There are such things as freedom of speech, equality before the law, one man, one vote, that kind of freedom of the press, freedom of religion. These things are achievements of Western civilization, and we arrived at them through centuries of struggle, all kinds of internal civil wars between Europeans. But now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, this is something that most white societies, they get it about right. They have a certain pattern of living, and most non-white societies get it wrong. They cannot build societies of that kind. They recognize the advantages of them, and that's why so many of them come pressing in to our societies. But when we cease to be a majority, the kinds of things that we're talking about, due process of law, freedom of speech, any kind of high trust civilization, that'll be gone. And what we're seeing now with these George Floyd riots, they have to do with demographic transformation. They have to do with the fact that so many blacks are unwilling to do the actual American thing and wait for an investigation to go through and arrive at its process. No, no. They want to rush to judgment immediately and have their enemies crucified on the spot. That's not the way Western civilization is supposed to work, but that's the way increasingly the United States works because the people living in it were not the people who created Western civilization, and in many cases, they don't give a damn for it.
Yeah, I'd like to just address the chat just really quick. If anyone thinks what Mr. Taylor's saying is just a mere opinion, then just go look at a map and look at any area in the United States that is like city, neighborhoods, towns, majority black, and tell me that there's not a cultural difference where the south side of Chicago is indiscernible from Haiti, other than it still might have some buildings and things, indiscernible from the Congo. I mean, culture being genetic is a consequence we're already dealing with in many more pockets in America than we'd like to have.
Well, I think that the south side of Chicago probably is a little bit different from Haiti, and that's why people come from Haiti to the United States, even if they end up living in the south side of Chicago. When I hear all of these black people talking about how miserable, how oppressive, how racist, how white supremacist the United States is, why are they not getting the word out to all of the non-white people everywhere? Stay home, fellas. This is a terrible place. And at the same time, why aren't they heading back to Africa? That's the motherland. That's build your own Wakanda, fellas. I wish African people well. I want black people to be the best possible black people they can be. But they're not going to be able to be the best possible black people if they're living with white people, constantly blaming us for their own failures and constantly living with their hands out. This is no way for any people to live. They need to take their destinies in their own hands and build a society the
There
best
was
that they can
um,
build.
there was a study, and I want to say 2009, maybe 2010, that 87% of somebody in the chat maybe can pull my card on that number if I misremembered. I know it was in the 80s. 80 some percent of black people had a vitamin D deficiency, which we're finding out more and more through medical science that it leads to higher rates of hypertension and cardiovascular disease and certain types of cancer. All of the things black people say happen to them not because they overeat and not because they're in a different environment from which they evolved and not getting enough vitamin D synthesization in their bodies, but that the emotional trauma of racism is causing them to suffer poorer health. I don't know if you've heard this new wave they're
Well,
pushing, or maybe it's not new.
I don't know when it comes to vitamin D, but there is certainly biological differences between blacks and whites. They do not necessarily react in the same way to the same drugs. And there are clearly biological underpinnings to different disease rates. Prostate cancer is considerably higher in blacks. And by the time it's detected, even if it's detected with the same kind of expertise, it is often at a more advanced stage in blacks than it is in whites. This probably has to do with higher rates of serum testosterone. There are biological differences. And when we keep denying them, any kind of difference in outcome is something that becomes blamed on apparently the horrible psychological and health effects of living under this constantly white supremacist regime. Now, there is an interesting statistic in the United States that is almost never talked about publicly, and that is suicide rates. White people commit suicide at 1.5 to twice the black rate. If it were the other way around, we know for sure that it would be blamed on the horrible experience of racism and oppression that black people have to suffer every day of their lives. But because the figures are the other way around, not something we talk about at all. Another interesting phenomenon is that there are many health outcomes for which Hispanics, despite the fact that they are less likely to have health insurance than blacks, less likely to go to doctors regularly than blacks, they have health outcomes that are in some cases better than whites. So what's going on here? This is all pure cherry picking. You find something, some outcome that is not good for blacks, and oh boy, that's by definition racism. If you have an outcome that's not good for whites, well, who cares? And if you have an outcome that, for example, for Asians have higher incomes than white people do. They're more likely to get into Harvard, more likely to get into Caltech. They have higher IQs. They live longer. And are we supposed to be imagining that, well, gosh, if you use the logic that people use with blacks, we must live in a yellow supremacist society. They're benefiting from yellow privilege. American society is stacked. The deck is stacked in favor of Asians. Isn't that the only explanation possible? Oh, no, 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 no. We just leave Asians completely out of the calculation when we're talking about white privilege and white supremacy. It's just so incoherent that it's embarrassing to live in a country that takes these ideas seriously.
So, is there any chance we get you to run for office?
No, I have said too many things that could be held against me in the current political climate. I think, though, that running for office is a great thing. Run for local office, even school board, city council. These are positions in which you have a podium. You can make a huge difference, even at the local level. And I am very disappointed that racially aware white people who don't have some kind of KKK background, never been walking around goose stepping, sig heiling, and there are plenty of white people who have got their act together, who are intelligent and make a good case. Why are they not running for office? I think that's one of the big mysteries and disappointments to me.
One more question, if you don't mind, Halsey.
Yeah, please.
I was doing a video. I have a very low rent channel. I've been banned so many times I can't build up a following. That's neither here nor there. I was just doing a channel where I was examining how long this anti-whiteness, black superiority thing has been going on, and I uncovered a sociology peer-reviewed study from 1971 that said that middle-class white children who are clean and hygienic are insulting black children who can't take a bath. Therefore, their conclusion was white children should stop trying so hard to be hygienic. This was 1971. So this stuff isn't new. It's just been pouring on us lately. Back then, I just assumed we ignored it. So what is your answer, if any, opinion to how we kind of counteract this stuff without having to have the peaceful separation? Like would ignoring more of it just work, or just emboldening people?
No, it can't be ignored. And this program that you have is an example of how to fight that. This is an example of not ignoring it. It's an example of trying to put out a counter, some way to refute the nonsense that is being shoved down our throat at every turn. We have the advantage that what we say is true. We have the advantage of what we say is entirely moral. It's in accordance with human nature, and it's in accordance with history. And there is nothing at all to be ashamed about to want your own people to flourish. Now, we have certain disadvantages. The media are very much against us. And when we talk about these things, we are likely to be banned. We're likely to be shadow banned. We're likely to be silenced in one way or the other. That is, of course, because what we say is so persuasive. If what we said was so stupid, so preposterous, they wouldn't have to ban us, would they? They don't see them banning much of anybody else. The Flat Earth Society isn't banned. Communists aren't banned, for heaven's sake. Anarchists aren't banned because they're not plausible. They're not going to be plausible. We are the people who have a dissident message that is genuinely attractive. We are the only people who are saying something interesting about the problems that have been plaguing the society since the middle of the 20th century. You're talking now, you see all of these hot air politicians talking about more police reforms, or maybe we'll just disband the police. I laugh when I hear this stuff. For decades, for 50, 60, 70 years, we have been reforming the police. We have been trying to sensitize them. And what do we get? We get high black crime rates. That's not going to change. You can turn the police inside out. You can fire them all. Black high crime rates are not going to change. And if you get rid of the police, boy, oh boy, look out, black people. You're going to be calling for the police to come back in your neighborhoods very soon.
That's one. Well, we'll end on this question because I've always noticed this. It's always bothered me, and I don't know how it can be combated. In the 80s, right, the crack scourge started, and black politicians flooded Washington. I remember as a kid seeing it on TV, and begged that they make the punishment for crack at a much higher level than any other drug because it was destroying their communities. And they did. They raised it to, I think, triple the rate of powder cocaine or anything else. Mm-hmm. And then they asked for police help. They said, you have to help us take back our neighborhoods. And they gave it to them. And within 10 years, they swore both of those things were racist and then wanted them reversed. And they do this on almost everything. How do you combat that level of circular thinking when you know it's going to happen every time you do it?
By pointing it out at every opportunity and trying to explain as often as you possibly can or have an opportunity to do so, the foolishness of this kind of thinking. It's always the case. If there are a lot of police in the black neighborhood, then that's over-policing. That's over-policing. That's no good. If you say, okay, we're not going to send police there, then, oh my gosh, the crime rate skyrockets. Then they're neglecting the community. You can never get it right. It's like white people. When they leave the neighborhood, that's white flight, and that was bad. And they should be living with black people and Hispanics. But when you have a majority black or Hispanic neighborhood and white people want to move in, ooh, that is, what do they call it now?
Gentrification.
Gentrification. We're wrong, no matter what we do.
It's the catch-22 of being white.
Yes, that's right. Being white, you can't get it right if you're white, no matter what you do. But the solution for all of this is to point out the preposterous stupidity of all of this. And that is the purpose, I understand, or I suspect, of programs like yours, our YouTube channel at American Renaissance, our website, our podcasts. That's the purpose of what we do, is to try to be some kind of beam of common sense and aim this beam of common sense into this fog of stupidity and obfuscation and downright dishonesty with which we are surrounded.
The warning that I try to make for my channel at the very least is that we're either going to be the Roman Legion or we're going to be the Roman Library. Meaning we're either going to be able to take back what's ours, and I agree, separation is the best case scenario. Or they're going to find us 1,000 years from now and say, look at what they built and look at what they lost, like when they found the old Roman libraries. And I try to point out everything I see, and I don't care if it's with my own people. I don't care if it's with my white side, my Jewish side. I don't care. I point out any kind of hypocrisy that I see, and I own whatever I can. But at the same time, I feel it's important to tell people that things are not getting better right now. You know, and you have to be ready, because especially I have children. Yeah, I know you have children. There are a lot of people that do, and to leave them kind of hopeless and not protected in this environment is a scary thought, you know?
Yes, it is a very daunting business bringing white children into the world in America today, because you know that they are going to be blamed for all of these awful things. You're going to be accused of having privilege. You're going to be accused of unconscious racism, even if they're trying very, very hard to be as kind as possible to non-white people. It's going to be a real problem. And I'm sure you've heard of this phenomenon of deaths of despair. These working class white people who, unlike every other demographic group in the country, their life expectancy is declining. Everybody else is going up. Why is it declining? They're dying of alcoholism. They're dying of drug overdose. They're dying of suicide. That's what they're called deaths of despair. It's not that the public health is failing them. They are psychologically failing themselves. And I cannot prove this, but I suspect that an important ingredient of these deaths of despair is the constant message that white people are worthless. White people are in the way. And the sooner that we get out of the way, then they'll have this hippie-happy, multiculti paradise that we're all supposed to be looking forward to.
I can tell you exactly why so many people in my neck of the woods are on oxy and methamphetamine and alcoholics, and it's because just so many people I've talked to growing up, now that we're in the 2000s, they will just tell you, just 15 minutes without taking a breath, just lay it all out there, that they've worked hard all their lives and made very little money. They have wives and children to take care of and can barely make ends meet, yet still everywhere they go, they're beat over the head as if they're responsible for other people's suffering. And what escapism do they have? They don't have a lobby that's going to stand up for them and
No.
say, leave these people alone. They escape the best way they can because they're not violent people. Europeans, by and large, are not violent people. Yeah, we had a lot of wars and stuff for conquest, but as like beating people in the streets and stuff, we're really not. We're a calm, peaceful people. So these people seek to escape these pressures any way they can. So they really are deaths of despair, addictions of despair,
It's
trauma
terrible.
of despair.
It's terrible. And the first group of people, there were two authors who looked into this. I believe they're husband and wife, but I can't remember their names. When they took this discovery and they tried to publish papers on it, the reaction they got from academic editors was, huh? White people? Who cares? And that tells you a lot right there.
It does, and I actually wrote a paper on this where it's about high IQ and the concept of failure. And there's only two societies that actually own the concept of failure. It's Asians and whites, or Asians and Europeans. And if you look at it, that is directly correlated to the idea of suicide. Japanese kamikazes, they would rather, instead of failing their mission, they would rather sail their plane and do the honorable thing into a ship, right? White people have a concept of failure that other races don't.
Well, a concept of failure combined with a sense of personal responsibility can lead to suicide. I think many Black people have this sort of happy-go-lucky attitude that means that it doesn't make any difference. They're not going to end it that way. They don't feel responsible. They've always got some way to shuck off the responsibility onto other people, certainly white people and other Black people. But I believe we've come to about the end of the hour, have we not?
We have, and I apologize for keeping you. Everybody, you can find Mr. Taylor at American Renaissance, amren.com. His link is in the description. This video will be added to BitChute within the next 2 hours, and it will be available there exclusively. I take my videos off of YouTube afterwards so they can't ban my channel. But thank you very much. This has been, honestly, it's been a dream come true. I'm really, really happy that you were able to make it, sir.
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Best of luck with all your endeavors.
Same to you. Same to you. We'll be watching very, very closely, obviously.
Oh yeah, it was really fun. It was an honor.
Everybody, we will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you very much for tuning in.
My fellow Americans, tonight I am speaking to you because there is a growing humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border.
In all honesty, a border wall or steel slats won't work. But great bodies of water will separate us from the horrible Mexican rapists. Introducing the 2019 Trump Great border moat, stocked with the most aggressive penis fish, incredible man-eating alligators, and unbelievable genetically modified moose-cocked rape dolphins, as well as flying, migrant-eating sharkfish. So incredible.
I swore to protect our country, and that is what I will always do. So help me God. Thank you and good night.